Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping right back into the narrow, smoky streets of 1666 to unpack one of the absolute most disastrous events in urban history, the Great Fire of London. We're going to trace exactly how a single tiny spark in a bakery brought the third largest city in the Western world literally to its knees in just a matter of days. It's basically a historical, chronological thriller. So, let's jump right in.
You know, when we talk about historical disasters, there's so often this jarring disconnect between the impending doom and the sheer incompetence of the people in charge. Just listen to this quote. When the fire first broke out, local constables actually wanted to demolish some adjoining houses to stop it in its tracks. They even woke up the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, to get permission. His response? He takes one look at the flames, makes this incredibly arrogant, dismissive remark that a woman might piss it out, and goes right back to bed. He just chose to ignore it.
Well, here's the staggering punchline to the mayor's little nap. 13,200. That is the massive number of houses ultimately destroyed by the fire he thought was, just a minor inconvenience. Because he hesitated in those crucial early hours, the flames were just allowed to spread and consume the city. But how exactly does a whole city get completely wiped out that quickly? Part 1. A city built for fire.
To really grasp the scale of this destruction, we gotta look at the environment. London in the 1660s was this crowded, unregulated medieval maze crammed with roughly 400,000 people. Diarist John Evelyn called it a wooden, northern, and inartificial congestion of houses. Basically, it was a literal tinderbox. Imagine multi-story timber houses with these projecting upper floors, they called them jetties, that practically touched across the narrow little alleys. Down by the river, you had these rickety shacks and cellars just packed with highly combustible stuff like pitch, tar, hemp, and rosin. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, you had black powder left over from the English Civil Wars stashed in people's private homes. Plus, 500 to 600 tons of gunpowder sitting right there in the Tower of London. So, every single ingredient for a mega catastrophe was perfectly in place. To see how this disaster unfolded, we're going to anchor our story to a chronological ticking clock. We'll move day by day, from the initial spark on Sunday to the final containment on Wednesday.
Part 2. The Pudding Lane Spark.
The whole thing kicked off shortly after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd. A fire broke out at Thomas Farner's bakery on Pudding Lane. The occupants actually managed to escape by climbing out of an upstairs window and into the house next door. But in this incredibly tragic micro-narrative, the family's maidservant was just too terrified to try the window. She stayed behind. And when that house burned down, she became the Great Fire's very first victim.
Part 3. The Unstoppable Firestorm.
Now, what's really interesting here is the horrific physics of what happened next. What should have been just a localized bakery fire was aggressively pushed by a really fierce eastern gale. By mid-morning on Sunday, people completely gave up trying to put it out, and by Sunday afternoon, a true firestorm took over. It was literally creating its own weather system. The tight spaces between those overhanging buildings acted exactly like chimneys. A massive uprush of hot air left a vacuum down at ground level, which then violently sucked in inward winds, fueling the flames even more. The fire was breathing. It's absolutely terrifying.
By Monday, this beast of a fire pushed north right into the financial heart of the city. Bankers over on Lombard Street were scrambling to rescue their gold coins before they literally melted. The general letter office burned down, completely severing all communications. And with no news, extreme paranoia just took over. Since England was right in the middle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, wild rumors started spreading that foreign agents were out there throwing fireballs into homes. Mobs actually started attacking French and Dutch immigrants in the streets. Total, absolute chaos. Desperation was so high that hiring a cart to escape jumped from a few shillings to a staggering 40 pounds. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to about 133,000 pounds today. No way most people could afford that.
Which brings us to Tuesday, the absolute climax and the day of greatest destruction. Throughout all this panic, folks had been hauling their goods into St. Paul's Cathedral. They figured, hey, thick stone walls, wide plaza, it's a safe refuge, right? Well, the church was undergoing restoration and was completely covered in wooden scaffolding. On Tuesday night, that scaffolding caught fire. The sensory horror of this scene is just unimaginable. Within half an hour, the cathedral's heavy lead roof was literally melting and pouring down the streets. And in the crypt below, tightly packed stacks of books and papers were just completely incinerated.
all the traditional firefighting methods were utterly failing. I mean, London actually had a system of elm pipes for water, but the river water wheels under London Bridge burned up super early on, entirely cutting off the supply. The Lord Mayor, he'd already fled. Even King Charles's brother, the Duke of York, couldn't stop the spread. Finally, the garrison at the Tower of London took matters into their own hands. They ditched the useless water pipes and used their massive stockpiles of black powder to just blow up surrounding houses. This created vital, controlled fire breaks that the flames simply couldn't cross.
Part 4. Desolation and Containment. By Wednesday, that fierce eastern wind finally died down, and those explosive fire breaks actually worked. The fire was halted. But as the smoke cleared, the brutal, macro-scale reality of the tragedy set in. The numbers brilliantly illustrate this. Roughly 15% of London's entire housing stock was completely wiped out. Diarist John Evelyn walked out to the fields of Moorfields and Islington and noted that as many as 200,000 people from all walks of life were displaced. They were huddled in these makeshift, sprawling camps, reduced to absolute extreme misery and poverty. Yet, incredibly, the officially recorded death toll from the Great Fire is 8. Just 8 people. But we really need to look a little closer at that number. Modern historians like Neil Hansen argue that this figure completely defies belief. Think about it. When you factor in the thousands of undocumented poor people living in those shacks, victims of the street lynchings, and the folks who surely succumbed to starvation and winter exposure out in those camps, the true death toll had to be in the hundreds, if not thousands. The intense heat of that firestorm was easily hot enough to entirely cremate human bodies, leaving literally no remains behind to count. In the immediate aftermath, this deeply traumatized public demanded a scapegoat. The intense paranoia, fueled again by the Second Anglo-Dutch War, led the city to point fingers at Catholics and foreigners. They ended up accepting the confession of a simple-minded French watchmaker named Robert Hubert. He claimed he started the fire at the bakery. Hubert was convicted and hanged at Tyburn in October 1666. The really tragic part? It was only after his execution that records conclusively proved he was at sea when the fire broke out. He didn't even arrive in London until 2 days after the spark.
Part 5. Out of the Ashes. With the ashes literally still smoldering, the monumental task of rebuilding got underway. Charles II urged citizens to settle elsewhere to avoid a rebellion, but radical new visions for the city were already flooding in. Brilliant thinkers like Christopher Wren proposed these beautiful grid-based Baroque city plans. But because untangling property titles was just way too much of a legal nightmare, London was largely rebuilt right on top of its exact same medieval street plan. That said, some crucial things did change. The Rebuilding Act of 1666 banned wood exteriors, meaning the new city rose up in brick and stone. Streets were widened and river wharves were finally kept open for access. Plus, the sheer financial ruin of this event directly sparked the creation of the very first fire insurance companies. Pioneers like Nicholas Barbin started these up, and that eventually led to the creation of private, organized fire brigades.
The physical legacy of this disaster was also forever cemented into the London skyline. A 202-foot column designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke was erected right near Pudding Lane to commemorate the whole thing. Known today simply as the Monument, it stood there for over 150 years, featuring an inscription that completely falsely blamed Catholics for the popish frenzy that burned the city. That politically charged inscription wasn't actually removed until 1830. The Great Fire fundamentally altered London's residential structure, its economy, and its architecture, giving birth to the modern building codes and insurance industries we rely on today. Which kind of leaves us with a lingering question. Does a city have to burn to be reborn? And as we look at the rapid, unregulated urban sprawl in parts of the world right now, what unseen sparks are waiting in the architecture of our own modern cities? Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this historical thriller. Keep questioning and keep learning.